welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. If you think of the 1990s, you may think of The Simpsons, Nirvana, Seinfeld. But if you're a policy or security wonk, one of the things you're going to think of from the 1990s is a military response option that seemed to be one of the first things we considered for almost any dilemma, the no-fly zone. Today, I'm joined by two authors, Lieutenant Colonel Scott Cooper, United States Marine Corps retired, and Professor Stephen Raggi, who've written a fascinating book about no-fly zones, their politics, and their strategy. The book's entitled No-Fly Zones and International Security, Politics and Strategy, and was published in 2019 by Routledge. Steve and Scott, thank you both for joining us. If I could ask you guys to introduce yourselves briefly.
I'll go first. I'm Stephen Raggi, and I've been a professor at the Naval Academy for a kind of an overwhelmingly long time, almost 30 years. I've been teaching courses on foreign affairs, American foreign policy, and ethics and international relations. I came to the Academy from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where I served as an assistant dean. Before that, I taught at a few schools, one in Greece for a time, a school for Greek students. I majored in classics, and particularly ancient Greek, undergrad. And then I've also taught for a time at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and at the National University of Singapore. It's been a real delight to be part of the Naval Academy and to meet some of its extraordinary graduates, two of which are on the podcast with me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And for me, it's an especial pleasure because Dr. Raggi was one of my professors at the Naval Academy. I was one of his first students when he came there as an instructor. And to be able to write a book alongside your mentor is one of the great things that any academic should aspire to. I graduated from Annapolis. I spent 20 years on active duty in the Marine Corps, most of it flying the EA-6B Prowler. And so I got to participate in many no-fly zones in Bosnia, in Iraq, and also in Kosovo during the air campaign there. And so we were able to take the experience of Dr. Raggi in writing about many things academic and then my own personal experience into what we believe is the book on no-fly zones, but also there's not been books written on no-fly zones. So that's why we are the book.
Yes, I was going to say, I think that may be true. I'm not aware of any other book on no-fly zones.
As a matter of fact, it's a subject so little written on. This is the opposite of classics, where people have written about, the use of semicolons and Thucydides. So little written on. When we first did our Google searches on no-fly zones, one of the top 10 hits we got was about screen doors and actually keeping out houseflies. But at any rate, we've saturated the literature now.
Excellent. And I would be remiss if I didn't add that, like Scott, I was a student of Professor Raggi's at the Naval Academy, and these are two people who I've known for nearly 30 years and value as friends and mentors and are scholars and people who I admire. And so it's a real delight to be able to speak with you in more depth about your scholarship and your experiences here. But given that no-fly zones are not the new hotness in topics of international security, why did you choose to write about them?
First, I think they were for a time, as you pointed out. And I think they could be again. It's an extraordinary instrument to be able to seize the airspace of a country whose behavior is concerning you. But also, I could turn to Scott because Scott knew a great deal about these subjects, having been part of the enforcement of most of the no-fly zones that had ever taken part.
The background on why we wrote on it, too, is that, as I recall, Professor Raggi was headed to a political science conference. And this was when we were discussing a no-fly zone in Syria at that time. And as those discussions were happening, he was presenting a paper at this conference. And that's, of course, when the Google search turned up with screen doors as part of no-fly zones. But we both started discussing it. And at that conference, Stephen was approached by a publisher that said, would you consider writing something on this? He came back to me and said, would you want to collaborate on a book? And of course, I was astounded and excited about the prospect. But we realized there was so much being talked about on this and so little rigor that was placed around the topic itself.
One of the things I really actually appreciate very much about your book, especially given that it does, as you mentioned, fill a void in the scholarship, is that it is more descriptive than theoretical. And this gives me an opportunity to share one of my absolute favorite quotes from Alistair McIntyre. And so I'm going to indulge that. He says, "There once was a man who aspired to be the author of the general theory of holes. When asked what kind of hole, holes dug by children in the sand for amusement, holes dug by gardeners to plant lettuce seedlings, tank traps, holes made by road makers, he would reply indignantly that he wished for a general theory that would explain all of these. He rejected ab initio the, as he saw it, pathetically common sense view that of the digging of different kinds of holes, there are quite different kinds of explanations to be given. Why, then, he would ask, do we have the concept of a hole? Lacking the explanations to which he originally aspired, he then fell to discovering statistically significant correlations. He found, for example, that there's a correlation between the aggregate hole-digging achievement of a society as measured, or at least one day to be measured, by econometric techniques and its degree of technological development. The United States surpasses both Paraguay and Upper Volta in hole-digging. He discovered that war accelerates hole-digging. There are more holes in Vietnam than there were. These observations, he would always insist, were neutral and value-free. This man's achievement has passed totally unnoticed except by me. Had he, however, turned his talents to political science, had he concerned himself not with holes, but with modernization, urbanization, or violence, I find it difficult to believe that he might not have achieved high office in the American Political Science Association." So I appreciate the fact that you resisted the political science urge to theorize before you understand and describe. And I guess my question is twofold. One is, why is that? And two is, what do we know now from this understanding and description? What is a no-fly zone? What's encompassed by this?
Perhaps Scott should start with this one. I'm boycotting this conversation until you stop calling me Dr. Raghi and start calling me Stephen.
Of course, of course. You know, I think one of the first things to think about when you talk about no-fly zones, consider them, is the transformation of American air power. And we start the book in talking about this. If someone had discussed enforcing a no-fly zone over North Vietnam during that conflict, they would have been laughed out of the room. Because, of course, people forget we lost over 2,000 airplanes during that conflict. And so technology and the lessons that we took from our experience in Vietnam, in which we have the ability to enforce a no-fly zone, as I would say, you have the ability to pitch a no-hitter every day over some kind of airspace over enemy territory. And so that's the first thing, is just the simple fact that after Vietnam, we went to work and we established the ability to dominate the airspace. Then from there, and the other thing to think about with no-fly zones is the unique structure of the international order at the time. Every no-fly zone that has been enforced has, in large measure, I think, been an altruistic endeavor to try to stop an aggressor from harming someone that is being cast upon. For instance, in Iraq, it was the Kurds and the Shia. In Bosnia, it was Bosnian Muslims that we were trying to stop from being killed by a Serbian Air Force, and similarly in Libya and also in Kosovo.
And this is actually an extraordinary thing, to be able to intervene in a humanitarian crisis. And as Scott says, pitch a no-hitter, since in all of our experience with no-fly zones, which amounts to about 25 years of enforcement taken all together, since we've had some running simultaneously, we've never lost an American life. But we have actually, I think, suppressed quite a lot of activity that would threaten innocence.
So this raises an interesting question. Scott, you described the transformation of American air power as being responsible. And as I think through it, I'm unaware of another country taking lead or unilaterally imposing a no-fly zone. Is that a gap in my knowledge, or is that correct that this has uniquely been a tool of the United States? And if so, why?
I think you're correct. I mean, there certainly has been in the South China Sea a Chinese, at least, narrative in which they have claimed to want to impose a no-fly zone. But you are correct. You know, the United States and a coalition have always been what's been imposed on a no-fly zone. And I think, again, the other thing to really understand is that after 1989, the world changed. As we all know, we call this the post-Cold War era. And in that post-Cold War era, for humanitarian reasons, we saw that in many times there was a humanitarian crisis, and policymakers asked themselves, what can we do? And as we conclude in the book, and we'll talk a little bit more about, a no-fly zone is a way to not do nothing. That double negative is intentional. And so what you have is the world is crying out, do something. And it's the next step we find, because it's also especially at a cost that is appropriate for us, which is only monetary.
I just add to what Scott said that, yeah, the Chinese have spoken of creating an air defense identification zone, or you could say that Putin over Ukraine, simply by shooting down one Malaysian airliner, created a kind of a de facto brutal no-fly zone. But the U.S. is distinct in that what we were doing was creating no-fly zones with authorization from some international organization like NATO or the United Nations, and that we were doing this in a formal way. It's not to say that we couldn't have other de facto no-fly zones created, imposed, enforced, and never actually recognized as such.
So I am curious, though, from this description, I've got all the elements of my my political science Nirvana here, right? I have regime type. I have questions of international order. I have questions of transnational movements. And so I am curious. You did, as I mentioned, write a descriptive rather than a theoretical book. And was that a conscious choice because you didn't find a general theory that explained it? Or was it an effort to create a better understanding before attempting to jump into theorization? Or, I mean, because these are all the elements that international relations scholars love to weave into theories, right?
Partly it was a aversion to the, as McIntyre expresses, to over-theorization. We also wanted to be useful. Also, the tone that I had taken in the paper that I was preparing was very practical and policy-oriented. And finally, it does come down to what Scott was saying, that what unified all of the cases that I was looking at was that there was a great deal of pressure to do something, some sort of humanitarian intervention. Iraq, particularly when the Kurds were being abused at the end of Desert Storm, and Kosovo and Syria later, and what Gaddafi was doing just before his move on Benghazi. In each case, there was a great deal of pressure on the U.S. to do something. And in those days, when it was harder to resist such pressure than it is now it seems to almost pass unnoticed. They did present a way not to do nothing. And that was the tone that I expressed in my paper and that our publisher picked up on and offered us a contract in 24 hours, and we were off and running. There was hardly time to theorize.
So, as you mentioned, we have 25 years of combined history of no-fly zone enforcement, although that isn't a strict chronological 25 years. I'm curious whether no-fly zones have changed over that time, and if so, how and why.
I'd say that if you take a basic definition, and then I'll leave this to Scott, because he knows better than I how no-fly zones work. But a basic definition, just in simple terms, is that a no-fly zone is an airspace from which the sovereign power has been excluded. That's about it. The target country's airspace has been seized. The government's been denied the use of its air assets over its own land. It might have been barred. It might have been deterred, physically prevented, perhaps, persuaded not to. In any case, the airspace of a sovereign power has been usurped. And that is the essential character of all no-fly zones, I believe. They start out as something rather like a naval blockade, and they share these characteristics with a blockade. A blockade may be less controversial, less provocative than occupying a country because the ships that do the blocking are offshore and perhaps out of sight. Similarly, airspace can be seized less provocatively in that the air power that's banning the flights into or out or over a territory is not necessarily visible to the people. And in each case, the ships and the planes can be kept out of reach of the retaliation of the subject state. Those basic characteristics are what strike me as most important about no-fly zones.
And I think the other thing that we always have to remember when you ask about how no-fly zones have changed, Doyle, and Steve and I talked about this at length when writing the book, the justification and authority for a no-fly zone has always been central to its enforcement. The first no-fly zone, many people might recall, was after the ceasefire was signed after Desert Storm. What was allowed there at Safwan, and it was not even considered by General Schwarzkopf when he signed it, is that they allowed Saddam to continue to fly helicopters. And those helicopters were then turned on the people of Iraq, both in the south and in the north, but especially in the north. And so it was a UN Security Council resolution, UNSCR 687, that became the justification and the authority for what would be a 12-year enforcement of that no-fly zone. In similar fashion, I mean, the number of UN Security Council resolutions around the Bosnia no-fly zones are too many to count because so much was enacted from the UN during that troubled period of the 1990s in Bosnia. And similarly, in Libya, we certainly would not have gone there had we not had a UN Security Council resolution. The drama around Libya, although it was a no-fly zone really in name only, not in execution, it was an air campaign, mind you. But it was those UN Security Council resolutions that were key to it. I'm not sure that I see in the future that we're going to have that kind of consensus to enforce some kind of humanitarian operation like a no-fly zone.
Yeah, and I think the point that you made, Scott, about the source of authority for a no-fly zone is an important one, especially when you consider the distinction between the no-fly zones that you discuss in your book and the air defense identification zones that China has announced, and that ADIZs are broadly accepted under international law under the premise that the coastal state has the authority to control who enters their airspace. Now, China's ADIZs differ from normal practice in that they argue that it also applies to transiting aircraft and sovereign aircraft, which has not been the practice for the U.S. ADIZ or other ADIZs. But because it is fundamentally predicated on controlling access to your own territory, rather than denying, as you said, Stephen, the use of sovereign territory by a state, it can be done on more unilateral authority rather than requiring this type of international consensus in order to gain some sense of legitimacy. Your cases in the book, you look at Iraq, you look at Bosnia, and you look at Libya. One of the challenges that scholars of war face is that war is a relatively infrequent event. You have that challenge, but you have the great benefit that your infrequency is such that you're able to cover all of the cases. I believe. I mean, are there no-fly zones that aren't covered in the book? I think you got them all.
I think we did.
Yes, and in fact, during the peer review process, we did find that they made the case that the Kosovo Air Campaign, which we bring in as part of the Bosnian case, was not a no-fly zone, but was an air campaign. We agree with that, but we felt that it also needed to be included. So we even went beyond the cases in history.
That gives you a really unique perspective on this phenomenon because you have literally examined every instance of its use. And so I'm wondering if, taking a look at these three major cases, you can talk to us about how they differed and what lessons we took away from each of them.
So the one thing I would say in studying this and trying to figure out, after describing them in detail, what conclusions can we draw? Were they effective? And I think one of the conclusions, again, like I said, we talked about how it's a way to not do nothing, but also that they're probably not going to be successful at really changing things. It's a tool that you have in which you are taking one tool away from the aggressor. So, for instance, Iraq was flying its helicopters, massacring its own citizens. We were able to prevent that from happening, but that did not change the circumstances on the ground or politically in that country. And for 12 years, we continued what was essentially a status quo, taking one armed tool away from Saddam and his air force, but it didn't change anything. And I think that's one of the great conclusions, is that, no-fly zones are not likely to change anything on the ground. If you go to Libya as another case, we overstepped there. And we did, in fact, use air power in an air campaign to help bring about a regime change, but we're unwilling to put forth the effort to really do the rebuilding that's required of that. And we see a case in which perhaps it's worse off than it was even before we decided to intervene.
I'd agree with all that Scott said and say that in the case of Libya, what we had was no-fly zone, not just as a way not to do nothing, but a way to do something we really wanted to do. Basically, there was a large part of the policy-making establishment that didn't want to leave Libya unaddressed, as to their minds, Rwanda had been left unaddressed. And so there was a no-fly zone over Libya very briefly. Perhaps it lasted less than 24 hours before it morphed into an air campaign. No-fly zones, it should be noted, can't simply be imposed without violence. Something has to be done to suppress the integrated air defense system of the target state. And so we did that, and suddenly we had deprived Gaddafi of his air assets, and then it was just too tempting, really. There were so many other things that could be done in the situation. We took away his mechanized infantry that were about to enter Benghazi and cause a major slaughter. We provided wonderful intelligence to the forces that were on the ground, although we never put forces on the ground. We, in effect, became the rebel forces' air force. NATO offered them an air force. In the end, we helped them locate where Gaddafi was as he fled in his convoy. We even provided overview as he was separated from his convoy and as he was brutally put to death. That went far beyond a no-fly zone.
So, Scott, I know that you have a lot of firsthand experience in no-fly zone enforcement. You've spent many hours in the air over Iraq and over Bosnia. My perception is that the no-fly zone in Iraq, particularly as we got into the period of 2002, 2003, involved a lot more use of ordnance than the enforcement of the no-fly zones in Bosnia. I'm wondering if you can just kind of give us sort of the firsthand perspective of what it felt like to do each of those, how they were different.
I think, the rules of engagement for no-fly zones is always critical. And the Iraqi no-fly zone, until actually it was December 28th, 1998, it was actually a day I was flying, in which the Iraqis really first came to aggressively oppose the no-fly zone. They shot 3 SA-3s at the force up in northern Iraq, and then it kind of became an almost daily routine where we would enter Iraqi airspace, we would wait for them to shoot, and that would be a trigger in which we were allowed to then drop ordnance on those targets, and specifically those systems that had just shot at us.
So I hate to interrupt, but my understanding is that initially it was at the systems that just shot at you, but over time you were allowed to broaden that to shoot at other critical elements of the air defense system. Is that correct?
Exactly. And that was among the things as they expanded the rules of engagement. And really from 1998 until the invasion in March of 2003, what you had was about a 4.5-year period in which we were rolling back the Iraqi air defense systems.
It's like playing a soccer game, and when a player commits a foul, a red card's issued, but the other team gets to choose which player receives it. Precisely.
Now, I think it's critical to understand something of this. We had 12 years of no-fly zone enforcement, and there was great concern, you might remember, at the beginning of President George W. Bush's administration about these risky no-fly zones, and wondering, oh my gosh, what if we lose somebody to this no-fly zone? Is that an escalation? If you look at the cost, we have never lost anyone to enemy fire in a no-fly zone. If you look at the cost of that invasion and the occupation of Iraq between 2003 and really 2011 is what we used when we finally left there, it was about 100 times more expensive by cost. And of course, it was 0 lives versus 4,487 lives that were lost between the invasion and December 31st of 2011. And so that's remarkable. Now, a no-fly zone is not going to change anything. It's a way to maintain a status quo, but it's not likely to be significant in what it's going to bring about for change.
And when it's followed by something like the horribly ill-advised invasion in March of 2003, you've had 12 years of surveillance and information gathering, of suppression of the enemy's air defense system, of control over his airspace. You've been able to actually do a great deal of preparation of the battle space, the no-fly zone. And I'm not boasting of this. I'm actually saying there's something sardonic and paradoxical about this, that the enforcement of peace from the air actually was a great prelude to an invasion. Moreover, all this time, it was easy to sustain your presence in the air. Little notice was taken of the U.S. when Scott was there enforcing this zone. There were times when U.S. planes were being fired on many times a week, every single day for stretches, never reported, even in responsible international newspapers like the New York Times.
You spoke of the no-fly zone in Libya as being a no-fly zone only for a very brief time and in name only. And you created a distinction between air operations in Kosovo and a no-fly zone. And it strikes me that taking a look at the baggage associated with a no-fly zone, and this came up in particular when it was being discussed as a potential policy response option in Syria, is such that while you've characterized it as not doing nothing, it surely doesn't feel that way to the country on the receiving end, that especially the early days of a no-fly zone involve a large number of strikes that are designed to violently destroy and degrade the country's ability to interfere with air operations over their soil. I was struck in thinking about that by the example in Graham Allison's Essence of Decision, where when President Kennedy is asking about airstrikes to take out the Soviet missiles in Cuba, he's presented with something that just astounds him in its scope and scale. It's airstrikes all over the island in order to take out, again, the integrated air defense system, although integrated would be a pretty generous description of the state of air defenses in the early 1960s. But I'm curious if there is some aspect of this where the SOP, the off-the-shelf version of a no-fly zone, brings with it policy consequences that may not be intended or desired by someone who's thinking about it.
There, I understand the story Graham Allison tells as a matter of Curtis LeMay, wasn't it? Steering him into operations that were obviously imprudent. Didn't he promise that he would take out all of the Soviet assets on the island? But when asked how many there were, he had no idea. He had made a promise that he could in no way fulfill. Curtis LeMay also, I believe, was trying very hard to hedge out the U.S. Navy when he was afraid that his chance for the Air Force to solve this problem once and for all kind of thing was going to be lost to quarantine that might actually involve little or no violence. In any case, that's an unusual case, but I think you are right that policymakers may find that they're opening a bit of Pandora's box. In these few cases we look at, not so. The escalations were carefully, deliberately considered and then executed. They were more opening pathways than Pandora's boxes, pathways that Robert Gates, for example, was not eager to go down in Libya, but certainly most of the other advisors, Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, were.
I think one of the other things that you're hinting at there as well, Steve, is that there tends to be an analysis when you're contemplating a no-fly zone, that it is a slippery slope of escalation that we can never get away from. And instead, in these cases, that's not the case. We've avoided any kind of slippery slope. Now, one might say we got overly ambitious and optimistic by transitioning from a no-fly zone in Iraq to an invasion that turned into a catastrophe. One can look at what happened in Libya, in which I don't think that anyone can judge that to be a successful intervention. On the other hand, we were very fortunate in Bosnia and in Kosovo, for that matter, because what if, for instance, and many people that were around and watching the 1990s, we had these safe zones, Bihać, Sarajevo, all around Bosnia that were not, in fact, safe zones. Srebrenica is the perfect example. If you look at, July of 1995, a massacre occurred in which airplanes were flying over, unable to do anything to influence the situation on the ground. And that's really important to note that there are severe limits to what you can do in enforcing a no-fly zone with respect to the situation on the ground.
I think that's actually a pretty good segue to your concluding chapter, which is entitled The Politics and Prospects of No-Fly Zones. And in my introduction, I somewhat facetiously characterized no-fly zones as a product of the 1990s. But I think, Scott, you very appropriately framed the 1990s as a period in which the international system and the aspirations and the challenges that were there were uniquely well suited to, and the state of American air power. So I guess looking at what you see ahead, what are the politics and the prospects of no-fly zones?
Well, one of the things I would begin with is an operational question. And people certainly, I think, remember this when, at the time, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee in the summer of 2013 as they were discussing a no-fly zone in Syria. And when he was asked specifically about costs of this, he noted costs that were, enormous in both terms of financial cost, as well as what he believed was going to be a cost in blood. And so what we have right now is an expectation that, again, you're going to pitch a no-hitter every day. What if, for instance, we were to say you can expect to lose 5 airplanes a month in enforcing that no-fly zone? Is that a cost that you're willing to bear? And I think in thinking about this, that's probably a threshold we're not willing to cross, which is one of the reasons, as you look at technology in which we have some significant surface-to-air missiles that the Russians have proliferated, I would not be any good going against them as one that spent his career trying to suppress enemy air defenses. The S-300, for instance.
The large gap in capabilities that the U.S. displayed, the U.S. and other no-fly zone enforcers had over the Iraqis, over the Serbians, that gap, I think, has narrowed substantially. So I guess that major changes in technology have worked against the enforceability of no-fly zones, and that there isn't a whole lot of reason to think that a no-fly zone over North Korea could be enforced without any loss of life, like the ones over Iraq or Bosnia, which are 20 and more years ago. There was a Israeli F-16 shot down by Syrian air defenses back in early 2018, suggesting that even Israel, which had had great success in suppressing air defenses before, was not immune to strikes. And besides, part of the appeal of the no-fly zone has been the costlessness in terms of lives and the quick ability to extract. You could sustain a no-fly zone fairly easily. Little notice was taken of the U.S., inside the U.S., when we were enforcing a no-fly zone, and there was no call for, say, a decent interval, for example, before we would cease or terminate a no-fly zone. That kind of flexibility, I think, is largely a past characteristic of no-fly zones.
So, it strikes me as you talk about the states where we were successful and states where we would feel significantly constrained or challenged. And I hate to offer a theoretical observation, but is that it seems that no-fly zones may uniquely be well suited to dealing with a middle power. That against a great power or an advanced power, you're likely to encounter air defense systems that raise the risk beyond a level with which you're comfortable. And against a relatively undeveloped country, a no-fly zone is taken for granted. We've operated highly vulnerable systems such as unmanned aerial vehicles in the air over Afghanistan and East Africa for the better part of a decade or more without concern about any air defense systems posing a threat to them. So that raises an interesting question then as to whether, if the United States found itself in a position where it was at loggerheads with a middle power, a no-fly zone might be something on the policy options. But it also raises an interesting question because no-fly zones are very much associated with the Clinton administration, with the 1990s. And they may have assumed a status in the military perception, not unlike counterinsurgency or that dreaded word nation building. And I guess that's a question. Is this likely to become something that there's just little appetite in the military to take on because it's seen, well, you mentioned that it's relatively low cost. The cost is concentrated in assets and resources of which we have comparatively few. The term low density, high demand asset is one with which I'm sure Scott's very familiar, having served the majority of his career in squadrons that were described as such. So I'm curious what your perception is about the military's view of no-fly zones.
I could certainly take that on, and I can speak to the exhaustion that many people felt, especially in the Air Force, over having to deploy over and over again, enforcing these no-fly zones. I felt a little bit unworthy sometimes complaining about that because, I was on the infantry and on the ground. I was sleeping in a bed every night, but it was exhausting. I mean, I had 14 consecutive years that I didn't pay taxes because I was deployed, either enforcing no-fly zones or the like. What I would say is that the military is lukewarm at best about this because they know how long it's probably going to take. And so that's not to say that we live in an era of instant gratification, but when it comes to policy options, that is what we want. The military still remembers those glory days of the Weinberger or Powell doctrine, in which they felt like we should go in with overwhelming force. It should be a last resort. And it had to have a clear exit strategy. No-fly zones don't have an exit strategy. No-fly zones have something that you're going to continue to do, perhaps for a dozen years, perhaps for 2 decades.
That's how long it took with Iraq. I should mention that at the level of the people enforcing the no-fly zone, Scott can talk about the exhaustion. Here's Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, talking about the caution that ought to be felt. In April of 2013, he was fending off calls for a no-fly zone over Syria, saying, "We've been the victims of our own success. We've made the very difficult look very manageable for a long time." And he reminded people in a congressional hearing what kind of elaborate operations no-fly zones are. We shouldn't have a discussion of them without mentioning how much real-time coordination of intelligence and communications they involve, and just what a fleet of aircraft you have to have in the air at once. Scott, when he was first teaching me about these, pointed out that one of the important things to work out was your runway utilization plan, because in short order, you had to get, Scott, wasn't it about 40 planes off the ground?
Precisely. And so you needed airplanes launching every, 30 seconds. Because if you think about it, to launch 40 airplanes, one every 30 seconds, that's a 20-minute evolution.
And I guess that's kind of fascinating to me because, we mentioned earlier the Chinese ADIZ as a sort of, it's been perceived in some quarters as a kind of a quasi no-fly zone. And certainly I think some of the rhetoric surrounding it has no-fly zone like aspirations. And I guess I'm wondering, given the extraordinary logistical challenges that you mentioned, have we learned the lessons in terms of what risk might actually be posed by the Chinese to do this? I mean, have we actually looked in mirror image and said, if it's so difficult for us to do this, what is the likelihood that they will be able to do something that has that actual effect? Or do we allow the perception that they are constraining transit to perhaps escalate a competition more than it should?
Boy, that's a good question, Doyle. The one thing I think that's important to think about when you're contemplating a no-fly zone is that it's not going to be airplanes flying 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What you're really looking to do is to deny someone else from entering into your airspace. And that might also be punitive. If I can give an analogy, for instance, if you have one of your children that you want to forbid from going into your office. It's not as though you need to stand guard at your office all day long to prevent your toddler from going in there. On the other hand, if the toddler does go in there when you're not there, you have to have the ability to know he was there and then appropriately punish the country or the toddler so that they will learn their lesson. So I think that's one of the things is that, the Chinese don't have to have the ability to enforce it full time, but also do they have the ability to put together an aerial armada to oppose that? I think it's a tough call, and I'm not sure that they would have the assets to do that, nor do they have an interest. And again, this goes back to, I think, game theory and considering options. No one has an interest in escalating that. We never had an interest in escalation in any of the cases of no-fly zones, and nor would the Chinese.
Also, since we were practicing no-fly zones, one of the issues which drawn a lot of scholarly attention has been gray zone warfare, in which levels of force that are used are never quite sufficient to allow the target country to be sure of how to respond. It's funny that when we look at the way that Saddam and Milosevic and Gaddafi and Assad behaved, they were provocative in the greatest extreme, doing, for example, the use of chemical weapons on his own people. In Assad's case, Gaddafi threatened to go house to house, killing people. Milosevic and Saddam were both brutally abusive, whereas Putin and Xi Jinping have been quite cautious in leaving a veil of deniability, no matter how unconvincing, over their aggressions. Maybe the real problem with no-fly zones is that the people against whom they might be targeted know very well how to provide no casus belli, no sufficient provocation to justify a collective response like a no-fly zone. Remember, our no-fly zones have always been collective responses where we have used our prestige in an organization like NATO or the United Nations to organize an authorized response, authorized by an international organization. My sense now is that we don't have such prestige in NATO or in the UN that we could try to do such a thing, even if the administration were inclined. But aerial denial is what no-fly zones are for, and Putin and Xi are both very interested in exploiting such things for area denial. And the curious thing to me is that China flirted with not a no-fly zone, but a no-sail zone, where they very briefly declared that there would be a no-sail zone that was going to celebrate a anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army Navy. It was around Hainan Island, and it was between the 5th of July and the 11th of July in 2016, to be kind of a test of concept, a sort of a pop-up no-sail zone. And it was erected and lowered so fast that there was no way for the U.S. to deploy a freedom of navigation operation through it. In a sense, it was so short-lived as a no-sail zone that it was never tested and therefore never challenged, and therefore a success by a bizarre sort of limited definition.
In the very little bit of time that we have remaining, I think from the discussion, it seems clear that your examination of no-fly zones have concluded that they belonged to a unique set of circumstances, a unique moment in time in U.S. policy, in technology, in U.S. stature in the world. And so I guess I would ask each of you to take about 30 seconds and to say, based on that, what have we learned or what ought we have learned from our operations in that unique period that would influence us going forward?
Very briefly, seizing a country's airspace can be very useful, especially if the provocation is so great that international organizations can be organized to authorize. It can be done without cost in terms of lives lost to the target country's operations. Perhaps there will be flexible or creative ways to do such a thing against small or middle powers who abuse human rights. One thinks of Myanmar, and that it could be done perhaps even more easily than before. Not to say it was easy, but I mean to say It was not costly, as Scott compared it to the use of force on the ground. Perhaps if drones or other forms of non-manned or distant surveillance were used and more standoff weaponry.
I would say I'm not optimistic that they will be appropriate or even utilized in the future for two specific reasons. One is gathering a coalition that will approve such a thing. The fact that in Libya, UN Security Council Resolution 1973 had that specific wording that said that we could take all measures necessary. People have been chastened by that, especially the Russians and the Chinese. And then the other thing I would say is you have to have a circumstance, a tactical circumstance in which air power is an appropriate tool to be used. And I think what we found especially is so often what is occurring is on the ground. And, ask Sir Michael Rose, that was in charge of UNPRO 4 in Bosnia. Air power was a wholly, at the time, inappropriate tactical use of that UN force that was taken hostage a number of times. I think that's what we'd see as well, is that air power is probably not the appropriate tool for trying to impose our will or to separate powers or to prevent an aggressor.
Scott Cooper, Stephen Rogge, it's been an absolute delight to speak with you about your scholarship, the definitive work on no-fly zones in international security, politics, and strategy, published in 2019 by Routledge. Thank you both so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too.
It's a pleasure it's been. Thank you, Doyle.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.